The polished stock of the Henry rifle felt cool and solid in Margaret O'Sullivan's grip as she emerged onto the saloon's worn-down porch. In the alley, 3 inebriated cowboys had cornered young Eliza Mitchell, their crude laughter echoing like shattering glass in the desert air. It wasn't the firearm that stopped them cold, however. It was the figure of Reverend Miller's son, Jonathan, standing protectively between them and the terrified girl. His white collar was ripped and a trickle of blood ran from a fresh cut on his lip. "Step away from her." Jonathan Miller's voice was devoid of the gentle tone he used for his Sunday sermons. This was something different, something primal and more dangerous. The biggest of the cowboys spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well now, what do we have here?" he sneered. The preacher's boy trying to be a hero. His hand drifted down towards the pistol on his hip. "Maybe it's time you learned how the real world works, choir boy." Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger. In Redemption Gulch, Nevada, 1885, a man could be killed for far less than what these men were contemplating. And despite the town's whispers about her, the scandalized glares, and the conversations that abruptly ended when she entered a room, she would not stand by and let them harm the only man who had ever made her feel like she was worth saving. "What comes next?" she called out, her Irish accent a sharp counterpoint to the tense silence. "Depends entirely on whether you 3 are as foolish as you appear." The question left hanging in the arid night wasn't if blood would be shed, but whose it would be. In that instant, watching Jonathan Miller hold his ground against overwhelming odds, Margaret O'Sullivan knew she had already cast her lot. 3 months prior, Redemption Gulch was little more than a dusty outpost where dreams came to wither. An 18-month drought had parched the surrounding lands, leaving behind a network of cracks in the earth that resembled a divine, broken heart. Yet it was in this very brokenness that people found themselves drawn together in the most unforeseen ways. Jonathan Miller had been crossing the market square, his arms laden with provisions for the church, sacks of flour for communion bread, oil for the sanctuary lamps, and a bottle of liniment for old Mrs. Henderson's arthritis, when destiny chose to intervene. He came around the corner of Peterson's general store just as Margaret O'Sullivan was backing through the doorway, a heavy crate of bottled goods in her arms. The collision was unavoidable. Glass exploded against the boardwalk, the scent of amber whiskey mingling with the fine desert dust. For a long moment they were motionless, the reverend son and the saloon proprietress, encircled by the fragments of their public personas. "I am so terribly sorry," Jonathan stammered, immediately kneeling to help retrieve the bottles that hadn't broken. His gaze met hers for the first time, and a palpable spark passed between them. She was striking, certainly, but it was something more. A sharp intelligence shone in her green eyes, alongside an emotion he couldn't quite place. Perhaps loneliness, or maybe a flicker of recognition. "No real harm done," Margaret answered, her voice retaining the gentle melody of County Cork, though I imagine some might call this a bad omen. She took his offered hand to rise, her fingers staying in his palm just a fraction of a second longer than was proper. It was then he saw what else she had been carrying. Tucked beneath the liquor bottles were several small wrapped parcels, medicine, preserved food, a pair of children's shoes. While he had been gathering for God's house, she had been collecting for God's forgotten flock. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said, the name connecting to the pointed whispers he'd heard around town. I was not aware you were—" "What? Seeing to the Murphy children since their father shattered his leg in the silver mine?" Her smile was as sharp as a winter wind. "Or purchasing medicine for the Petersons' infant. Be careful, Mr. Miller. People might start to think you see me as a person." Before he could formulate a reply, she was walking away, the dark blue fabric of her dress swaying as she went. But she had left something behind. A small packet of fever powder had rolled beneath the store's steps. When Jonathan retrieved it, he saw the name written in her neat cursive, Tommy Morrison, age 6. That evening, as he delivered the medicine to the Morrison family's shanty on the edge of town, Jonathan Miller began to suspect that everything he had been told about Margaret O'Sullivan was a lie, and more perilously, that everything he believed about himself might be a lie as well. The question was not whether she was the temptation his father warned of, but whether he possessed the courage to discover the man he truly was, beyond the clerical collar and the weight of expectation. The drought broke 2 weeks later, But the rains brought trouble, not relief. Miners poured into Redemption Gulch, their pockets full of silver and their fuses short from months of grueling labor. The gilded cage, Margaret's inheritance from her late husband, became the epicenter of every new storm. It was on one such rain-lashed evening that Jonathan saw what the town's respectable citizens chose to ignore. 3 miners had backed 15-year-old Eliza Mitchell against the church wall, their intentions as plain as the terror on her face. They smelled of sweat and cheap whiskey, their hands already reaching for what they assumed was theirs for the taking. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He simply moved. He emerged from the shadows, armed with nothing but righteous fury and a silent prayer. "Let her go." The miners turned, their faces contorting in amusement. "Well, look what we have here," the largest one sneered, his beard matted with tobacco. "The holy man wants a turn." What followed shattered every notion Jonathan held about his own physical prowess. The first blow sent him stumbling into the mud. The second filled his mouth with the coppery taste of blood. He was on his knees, arms defensively wrapped around his head, when the sharp, metallic click of a rifle being cocked sliced through the downpour. "Gentlemen." Margaret's voice was imbued with the kind of command that came from managing a place where any sign of weakness was an invitation to ruin. She stood at the alley's entrance, rain matting her auburn hair to her neck, the Henry rifle held steady. "I do believe the young lady would prefer to be elsewhere." The miners glanced from the gun to the woman, weighing their chances. Margaret made the decision for them, firing a round into the wooden fence just inches from the leader's head. "The next one will be between your eyes, William Crane," she said, and Jonathan was astonished that she knew his name. "It's your choice." They backed away, spewing curses and threats, but they left. Eliza fled home to her family, tears of relief carving paths down her dirt-streaked face. And Jonathan Miller was left alone in the rain with the woman his father had branded the devil's own instrument. "You could have been killed," Margaret said, helping him stand. Her touch was surprisingly gentle as she professionally checked his injuries with the practiced hands of someone who had tended to many wounds. "That was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Likely both," Jonathan conceded, wincing as she inspected his split lip. "But I couldn't stand by and watch." Something in her expression shifted then. Surprise, maybe, or a glimmer of respect. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you cleaned up before your flock sees their shepherd looking like he lost a brawl with a pack of coyotes." The interior of the gilded cage was not what Jonathan had envisioned. There were bottles and card tables, yes, but there were also books lining a shelf, curtains on the windows, and a corner in the back where children's primers were stacked next to small slate boards. "You teach them," he stated, more of a realization than a question. "Someone has to," Margaret said, pouring warm water from a kettle into a basin. "The territorial government swore they'd send a school teacher 2 years ago. We're still waiting." She gently dabbed at the cut on his cheek. "Drink this." "I don't—" "Coffee," she clarified, amusement flickering in her green eyes. "Though heaven knows, after a night like this, you might need something stronger." As she treated his injuries, she spoke of her late husband, Patrick, killed in a mine collapse 18 months before. She talked about inheriting a business she never wanted, but learning to run it because the only alternative was to starve. She described the deep loneliness of being the town pariah, respected for her resilience, but feared for her independence. "People need a scapegoat for their own failings," she remarked, cleaning the blood from his knuckles. "It's easier than facing their own reflection." "Is that why you stay?" Jonathan asked. "To be their scapegoat?" Margaret paused, her eyes meeting his in the warm lamplight. "I stay because this is my home, and because sometimes someone has to stand between the wolves and the sheep." She offered a soft, sad smile, even when the sheep don't appreciate it. When he left that night, walking through the muddy streets toward the parsonage, Jonathan Miller was carrying more than just bruises. He carried the memory of Margaret O'Sullivan's hands on his face, the echo of her laugh, and the dangerous realization that everything he'd been taught about sin and salvation was far more complex than he had ever conceived. Behind him, the saloon's lamps still glowed in the windows, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was watching him go. Their clandestine meeting started innocently. Margaret had remarked on needing help with the children's lessons, and Jonathan had offered his assistance. It was godly work after all. The fact that it involved spending time in Margaret's company was, of course, purely a secondary benefit. 3 evenings a week. Long after the last drunk had been ushered out of the gilded cage, Jonathan would slip in through the rear entrance. In these quiet hours, the saloon was transformed. The tables were pushed back, and the rough laughter of minors was replaced by the soft murmur of children's voices. Margaret was a natural teacher, patient with those who struggled and encouraging to the quick learners. "Reading opens doors," she told 10-year-old Jamie Peterson, guiding his small finger across the words in a tattered copy of Robinson Crusoe. "Each book is a new world waiting for you." Jonathan watched her from across the room while helping little Maria Santos with her sums, but his focus continually drifted. He noted the way the lamplight ignited the copper threads in her hair, the elegant curve of her neck as she leaned over a child's work, and the effortless grace in her movements, every gesture a testament to a strength softened by compassion. "Mr. Miller," Maria whispered, tugging his sleeve. "You're staring again." Heat rose in Jonathan's cheeks. "I was merely observing her teaching methods." Margaret looked up, catching his flustered expression, and smiled. It was a different smile from the sharp, guarded one she wore by day. This one was warm, intimate, and meant only for him. After the children departed, they would sit together by the fading embers of the fire, discussing everything and nothing. Margaret shared stories of her childhood in Ireland, of the famine that had forced her family to emigrate, and of the dreams she held before life taught her that survival was more important than hope. "I wanted to be a teacher," she confessed one night, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the table. "A proper one in a schoolhouse. Foolish, I suppose." "Not foolish," Jonathan said softly. "Beautiful," the word hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Margaret's eyes met his, and for a heart-stopping moment, the careful boundary they had maintained seemed ready to dissolve. "Jonathan," she whispered, and his name on her lips was both a prayer and a profanity. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was warm, calloused from work, yet soft in a way that made his breath hitch. "Margaret, This is dangerous," she said, though she didn't pull her hand away. "For both of us." "I know." His thumb stroked her knuckles, and he marveled at how such a simple touch could ignite his entire being. "I know what they'll say. What he'll say." They both knew who he was. Reverend Samuel Miller's disapproval had grown more palpable with each passing week, his sermons filled with pointed allusions to temptation and moral decay. The congregation was starting to notice Jonathan's distraction and his father's mounting frustration. "He loves you," Margaret said. "He's afraid of losing you." "And I'm afraid of losing myself if I don't." Jonathan let the sentence hang, unable to voice the truth they both knew. That night, walking home through the deserted streets, Jonathan Miller made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He would no longer conceal his feelings for Margaret O'Sullivan. The only question was whether Redemption Gulch and his father could handle the truth. Behind him, a silhouette stood in the saloon window. Watching him disappear into the night, her hand pressed to the glass in a gesture that felt like a farewell. The confrontation erupted on a Sunday morning, in the hallowed space where Jonathan had spent his life learning of grace. Reverend Samuel Miller stood at the pulpit, his weathered hands clenched, his gaze fixed on his son in the front pew. "There are wolves among us," he thundered, his voice carrying the full weight of Old Testament prophecy. "Wolves in sheep's clothing, who lead the righteous into temptation with false promises." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He knew what was coming. He had felt it building for weeks in his father's sermons on moral purity and the peril of associating with the town's less savory elements. "The Lord commands us to be separate from the world," Samuel continued, his eyes never leaving his son, "to avoid even the appearance of evil. There are those who would have us compromise our values, who would drag us into the mire of sin." Mrs. Henderson nodded fervently from her seat, while the mayor's wife whispered to her companion. Both women cast significant looks toward the back of the church where, to Jonathan's surprise, Margaret O'Sullivan was sitting alone. She had come. Despite the whispers, despite the judgment, she had put on her finest dress and walked into the very heart of the community that ostracized her. Her chin was held high, her green eyes defiant, but Jonathan could see the effort it cost her in the tense set of her shoulders. "Some may ask," Samuel's voice escalated, "why we permit such corruption in our town. Why we allow establishments of vice to operate while good people struggle to raise their families in righteousness. The air in the small church grew heavy. Every head turned toward Margaret, the collective condemnation almost a physical force. Jonathan saw her hands twist in her lap, saw the moment her defiance started to waver. He stood. The scuff of his boots on the wooden floor echoed in the abrupt quiet. His father paused, his righteous fury replaced by shock. "If I may, Father," Jonathan said, his voice firm despite the trembling in his hands. "I would like to share something." Samuel's eyes flashed a warning, but he ceded the pulpit. Jonathan walked to the front, acutely aware of every eye in Redemption Gulch upon him, waiting for him to finally denounce the woman they believed had led him astray. Instead, he looked directly at Margaret, finding strength in her gaze. "I have learned something in recent months," he began. "I have learned that grace is not something we earn through perfect conduct or a sterling reputation. It is something we give and something we receive, often from the most unlikely of sources." Mrs. Henderson's fan snapped shut. "I have seen a woman use her own money to feed hungry children while so-called respectable folk cross the street to avoid them. I have seen her teach reading and writing to youngsters the government has all but forgotten. I have seen her stand between innocence and harm, asking for nothing in return." Margaret's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she held his gaze. "And I have learned," Jonathan's voice grew stronger, "that sometimes the person everyone calls a sinner is doing more of God's work than the person everyone calls a saint." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Mayor Whitman, a man with a keen sense of political winds, cleared his throat. "Well said, Jonathan," he declared, starting a ripple of applause. "Well said." Others joined in, not all, but enough. Mrs. Peterson, whose children Margaret taught. Jim Collins, whose broken arm she had set when the doctor was away. Eliza Mitchell's parents, who knew exactly who had saved their daughter, but not Samuel Miller. The Reverend stood frozen, watching the world he had so carefully constructed begin to fracture. After the service, as the congregation dispersed in buzzing groups, Jonathan approached his father. Samuel's face was ashen, as if he had aged 10 years in half an hour. "You have made your choice," the old man said softly. "I pray to God it does not damn you both." "And I pray," Jonathan replied, "that you will find it in your heart to trust that the son you raised knows right from wrong." Outside, Margaret was waiting by the church steps, her posture uncharacteristically uncertain. When she saw him, relief washed over her face. "That was either incredibly brave," she said, echoing her words from the night in the alley, "or incredibly foolish." Jonathan took her gloved hand in his, no longer caring who was watching. "Definitely both." The retaliation was swift and merciless, coming 3 nights later like a sudden storm. Jonathan was in his study, preparing a sermon on the Good Samaritan, when the sound of shattering glass tore through the night. Through his window, he saw an orange glow against the sky, flickering from the direction of the gilded cage. He ran through the dark streets, his heart pounding. By the time he arrived, half the town was already there. Some held buckets, ready to fight the blaze. Others had brought chairs, settling in for the show. "Where is she?" Jonathan demanded, grabbing Jim Collins's arm. "Where's Margaret?" "Inside, far as anyone can tell," Collins answered grimly. "Front door's been barred from the outside. Someone wants to make sure she doesn't get out." The crowd parted as Jonathan pushed through, his gaze sweeping the faces until he found them. 3 miners from the Copper King, the same men who had accosted him and Eliza. Their leader, William Crane, stood with his arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. "A shame about the fire," Crane said loudly. "Of course, some might call it divine justice. The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he, preacher boy?" Jonathan didn't bother with a reply. His fist connected with Crane's jaw, sending the larger man stumbling into the dirt. The crowd gasped. "Jonathan Miller, the gentle son of the Reverend, throwing punches like a saloon brawler. The bar!" Margaret's voice cried from within, muffled and desperate. "I can't move it." While the miners scrambled to their feet, Jonathan slammed his shoulder against the heavy timber wedged against the door. It was new wood, strong, chosen for this purpose. Smoke billowed from under the door, and he could hear Margaret coughing. "Help me," he yelled to the onlookers. "For God's sake, help me." A few people moved to help. Collins, Mayor Whitman, a handful of others. But most held back, unsure if saving Margaret O'Sullivan was worth crossing whoever had set this fire. That's when the sharp report of a rifle echoed from the edge of the crowd. Reverend Samuel Miller stood there, his hunting rifle aimed squarely at William Crane. The old man's hands were trembling slightly, but his voice was like granite. "Step away from my son," Samuel commanded. "All of you. Step away now." Crane spat a mouthful of blood, his hand inching toward his pistol. Samuel's rifle followed the movement. "I was fighting natives when you were still on your mother's milk, boy," the Reverend said quietly. "Try me." The bar across the door finally splintered and broke. Margaret stumbled out, her dress torn and her face smudged with soot, but she was alive. Jonathan caught her, holding her tightly as her body shook. "It's all right," he whispered into her hair. "You're safe." But even as he held her, Jonathan knew that nothing would be all right again. Lines had been drawn and choices made. Redemption Gulch would have to decide what kind of town it was, and if it had room for a love that broke all its rules. Crane and his men melted into the darkness, their parting threats lost on the wind. The fire was put out before it could spread. But the damage had been done, not just to the building, but to any hope of a peaceful resolution. "Thank you," Margaret whispered to Samuel Miller, who still stood guard. The old preacher's eyes were sad, but his expression was firm. "Don't thank me yet, daughter," he replied. "The real battle is just beginning." Dawn crept over Redemption Gulch, painting the desert in hues of rose and gold, promising both endings and beginnings. Jonathan sat with Margaret on the steps of her damaged saloon, watching the sun rise. The night had changed both everything and nothing. The gilded cage could be rebuilt if she chose to stay. The deeper wounds, etched into the soul of the community, would take much longer to heal. "Your father surprised me," Margaret said, her voice raw from the smoke. "He surprised himself, I think," Jonathan answered. "Sometimes it takes a fire to show us who we truly are." Samuel Miller had retreated to the parsonage, his duty done. But Jonathan knew his father was wrestling with a lifetime of rigid beliefs, now challenged by the undeniable truth that grace could appear in the most unexpected of places. "The town council will meet today," Margaret said. "There will be talk of shutting me down for good, of running out the undesirable elements." She gave a wry smile. "Meaning me? And what will you do?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, her green eyes mirroring the morning sky. "I've been thinking about what you said in church. About grace, about unexpected sources." She turned to face him. "What if we gave them something truly unexpected?